Welcome, and I'll call this meeting to order, this being meeting number 19 of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Today, pursuant to order of reference of Tuesday, October the 16th, 2007, Bill C-327, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act, reduction of violence in television broadcasts. We welcome Mr. Bigras. Welcome, and if you'd like to give your opening statement, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to committee members for receiving me. I prepared a brief. Unfortunately, I did not have time to translate it, given the limited time we had to prepare ourselves for this meeting today. Dear colleagues, in November 1992, a young girl, 13-year-old Virginie Larivière, who had just lost her sister, victim of a violent crime, handed Prime Minister Brian Mulroney a petition signed by over 1.5 million Canadians who demanded an act intended to reduce violence on television. At the time, the young girl had raised a true public debate on the role of government, broadcasters, and parents in the face of widespread violence on our television screens. Broadcasters and the CRTC were quick in responding. A few months later, in 1993, the CRTC adopted the voluntary code concerning violence on television, drawn up by the Canadian Broadcasting Association. By complying with this code, Canadian private broadcasters are publicly supporting the following principles: that programs containing gratuitous violence not be broadcast, that young children not be exposed to programs that are not suitable to them, and that TV viewers be informed of the content of the programs they wish to watch. In June 1993, the Standing Committee on Communications and Culture of the House of Commons concluded that the self-regulatory approach had to be given a chance. However, the committee agreed that if that approach did not yield results, legislation would have to be adopted. 15 years later, where are we at? According to an analysis conducted by the Media Center at the University of Laval in December 2004, physical acts of violence on television increased by 286% in 10 years. 81% of acts of violence were part of programs shown before 9 p.m., and 29% of acts of violence in films were psychological in nature. Of course, we can play with numbers. However, the facts are the facts. Violence on the small screen is widespread enough to influence the behavior of our children. It is clear that the self-regulatory approach of broadcasters has not yielded results close to 15 years after the adoption of the voluntary code. Quebec still recalls the report by coroner Catherine Rudel-Tessier concerning the death of an 11-year boy on December 31st, 2005. In the report, coroner Rudel-Tessier recalls the story of young Simon. Simon is a young, healthy child, full of life, and in the evening of December 30th, 2005, around 7 p.m., Simon and his father decided to watch the film The Patriot broadcast on a television network. As described in the coroner's report, an unscheduled visit changed Simon and his father's plans. The child was watching the movie alone, and his father promised to rejoin him. Towards 8:10 p.m., the young child was found hung in front of images of The Patriot, a film which is a 13-year-over movie in Canada. According to Rudel-Tessier, nothing defends the hypothesis of a suicide. According to the coroner, the child probably wanted to reproduce a scene in the movie movie which was broadcast at 7:34 p.m., where the son of the hero is brought to soldiers to be hung from a tree. Perhaps the young Simon was impressed by another scene which was broadcast at 8:01 p.m. Finally, Coroner Catherine Rudel-Tessier questioned whether the film should have been shown at 7 p.m. The voluntary code did not prevent the broadcasting at 8 p.m. of a major network of the movie in French entitled Sous les traces de l'ennemi, which is an 18-year and over film with violence and coarse language. The voluntary code did not prevent as well the film entitled in French Un pied dans la tombe, broadcast on September 12, 2007 at 8 p.m., and which was a 14-year over movie with coarse language and violence. I think it is time to act. I would like to recall that in June 1993, the Standing Committee on Communications and Culture of the House of Commons, which we now call the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage, concluded that the self-regulatory approach had to be given a chance. However, the committee agreed that if that approach did not yield results, lawmakers would have to adopt legislation. That is the spirit of Bill C-327. The bill that we are considering today is intended to require the CRTC to adopt regulation to limit the broadcast of violence on television, requires the CRTC that it monitors itself the compliance of broadcasting undertakers with regard to their obligations in terms of violence, and to sanction offenders, as well as to hold hearings every 5 years to assess the results of such an approach. In conclusion, over 15 years after the adoption of a voluntary approach, it is clearly time to adopt a regulatory approach. Our teachers who work daily with our children wish for such legislation, and our children merit such legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question will come from Mr. Boulanger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Mr. Bigra. Mr. Bigra, I want to see whether in your discussions with stakeholders, you've had discussions on not only the broadcasting of certain programs and films at certain hours, but on broadcasting in general. These days, another debate is being held in Parliament and elsewhere with regard to programs or films that could not be funded by the government. And perhaps we can make a distinction between that debate, which we'll be hearing about in the next coming weeks, and the issue of broadcasting of violence on television. Now, in preparing your bill and your presentation today, do you make this distinction? Well, of course. We make such a distinction because what is fundamental is there be a balance between the freedom of expression and the protection of our children. We cannot infringe on the freedom of expression, but at the same time, we have to guarantee a quality programming for our children. The bill does not specifically say what the regulation should be. It simply states that there should be regulation with regard to violence on television within the Broadcasting Act. A regulation which has to be determined following public debate. And hopefully parliamentarians will engage in the debate, especially here at the Heritage Committee. I believe those regulamentations be put to parliamentarians. As for broadcasting hours, of course we cannot prohibit the broadcasting of a film. That would be non-constitutional, and that would infringe on the freedom of expression. What we're saying is that if a film is 13 years and over with violence, or 18 years over with violence and coarse language, that those films be broadcast after the prime time viewing hours. And now is that 9 p.m., 10 p.m.? Well, the debate has to continue. But clearly, in my view, there needs to be a regulation in the Canadian Broadcasting Act, and that is the intent of Bill C-327. Are you aware that there were technological provisions with regard to this issue? We've long heard about a V-chip, which would allow parents or babysitters or whoever to program television sets in such a way that programs with violence not be broadcast either at certain hours or not at all. In preparing your bill, did you check reports on that technology? That technology is now integrated in all new television sets. 15 years ago, that technology was first being rolled out. But indeed, that technology is now integrated into people's television sets. But if we ask the question to people on the street whether they know whether those chips are integrated, the answer would be no, they'd not be aware of that. In the coroner's report on April 11, she clearly says that the measures might not be adequate, and she suggests that parents control the programs that parents allow their children to view. And all television sets, as I indicated, have those V-chips, which allow parents to screen the programming. So yes, that technology is available. Now, does it yield results? I think it's still early to say whether that is the solution to protect our children with regard to programming on television. Last brief question. If indeed parents used that technology, do you think that would be a solution? Well, there's another problem here. There's the problem of ratings. Take, for example, the Patriot, which was rated 13 years and over. When you go to the States, that same film, actually what they recommend to parents is that a person over 17 years of age accompany children watching that film. So it's also a question of ratings and of raising awareness. But at the end of the day, what we found out is that, yes, raising awareness is fundamental, but it does not solve all problems. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Bigra. I would like to congratulate you on your bill, because I think the lives of our children are very important, especially after hearing the examples that you've given us, such tragic examples. I would like for you to talk to us about the link between violence on television and the victimization of children, violence among children. So the impact that violence on television can have on children. Is it such a tragic issue, or is this a tempest in a teacup? Well, we have to distinguish between two kinds of violence. There's physical and psychological violence. And what we found out in the past few years, when you read the report which I mentioned and hear from witnesses, Mr. Guy Paquette and Jacques de Guise from the Media Center at the University of Laval, who studied that issue in the past few years, a report tabled in 2004, they, in fact, cannot conduct any more studies because the Government of Canada decided to cut funding to the Media Center at the University of Laval. What we realized by reading that report is that there are two types of violence. As I said, physical and psychological violence. And it's more and more difficult to define what psychological violence actually is. But what we realize is that there's more and more psychological violence, and it's on the increase, even more so than physical violence itself. I met many teachers in Montreal, and they tell me that their children tend to imitate what they see and what they hear on television. And a teacher told me that in the schoolyard, there are young kids throwing their bags at each other to imitate the Pokemons. So teachers are on the front lines, and they've noted that after kids watch a film the night before, the following day they're more agitated. There are over 3,000 studies that have been conducted on such violence, and children tend to imitate what they see. I think we have to be aware of that, and especially aware of the importance of psychological violence. Now we're talking about violence on television. In fact, we're talking about both films, cartoons. You're talking about all kinds of programs on television? Well, the more accessible ones to our children. So even though there are examples of young people who, for instance, after having listened to the nightly news and Saddam Hussein's hanging, well, there are at least 2 people who tried to imitate what they saw on the news that night and hung themselves. So I think we have to be careful. But when children listen to a certain type of program, we must be aware that they tend to imitate what they see. The report by Ms. Rudel-Tessier is a bit clear on that issue. And there are a number of recognized psychological reports that show that children tend to imitate what they see, either in cartoons or in violent films. You know, there are cartoons. You know, my son watches, those specialized cartoon channels. And sometimes I watch along with him, and sometimes there's very coarse language that's used on those channels, used by those cartoon characters. And sometimes, I watch that show, and, I say to myself, that's not a program for young children. It's more for teenagers of 14, 15 years of age. And so those are cartoons. Do you think we should also regulate the cartoon programming, which might be deemed either too violent or containing vulgar and coarse language? Well, we could talk about South Park, for instance. First, we have to rate and do an adequate rating. That's the first thing we have to do, not only for films, but also for cartoons. So, first, we need to have a rigorous rating system. And when we say that on the U.S. side there's a lot of violence, yes, it's true, there's a lot of violence there. But when you compare the Canadian and U.S. rating systems, you realize that the U.S. rating system is much more rigorous. So I think we have to deal with that rating system, and once that is in place, and yes, it's clear that if cartoons are rated 18 years and old because they contain coarse language, well, yes, in my view, those cartoons should be broadcast only after 9 p.m.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here today, Mr. Bigras. I know this is something you've worked on for a long time, and I commend you for following up on the efforts of Virginie Larivière and the millions of Canadians who supported her campaign. Mr. Bigras, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, are there organizations or individuals who've supported your bill? It's been around for a while, and I wonder if there are organizations and individuals who've come on board to say that they think this is an appropriate way to go and have commended the work that you've done.
Oui, bien sûr, depuis 2000, comme vous l'avez
Well, since 2000, well, actually, this bill is a follow-up of Bill C-490, which I tabled at the start of the year 2000, I believe. And from there, in Quebec, a coalition was set up to support that bill. A coalition made up of the trade unions in Quebec, including the largest teachers union in Quebec, because teachers experience that on a daily basis, as well as the daycare workers. At the time, they were under the wing of the CSN union. And I think of an organization whose spokesperson is the well-known actor René Caron, who tours schools to raise their awareness of violence on television. I think of organizations such as those which work with our children daily and would like to reduce violence on television, because television is a means of transmission. There are other ways. I'm thinking of internet, of video games, but I think that television and regulating violence, television is the primary means. It is a symbolic means, and I think we should concentrate our attentions there.
Creators of television programs and films to the kinds of suggestions that you're making in this bill?
Non, j'ai eu aucune.
No, I did not hear anything from them.
I know that you figure on that you focus on television violence. There have been concerns raised about video games and that kind of those kinds of violent video games.
Mm-hmm.
Have you paid any attention to that, or is there a reason why you haven't addressed that in this legislation? It seems to me that that's also an area where people have expressed many concerns about what children and youth are exposed to in video games.
Tout à fait.
I agree with you. The issue of violence on television is probably the type of violence where we can easily regulate. It's very difficult to regulate the internet. It's open to all, so regulating the internet would be very difficult. But what we do know is that as a society, the message that we would send by adopting Bill C-327 would be that we, in Quebec, in Canada, want to build a nonviolent society without any discrimination, regardless of gender, regardless of origin. I think that would be an important message to send by way of Bill C-327. This is a bill that, of course, can be improved on, and I do hope there is a wide-ranging debate that can be held.
States had more rigorous regulations in this regard. Could you say a little bit more about that? And maybe are there other countries that provide models for Canada in the area of regulating violence on television?
Bien sûr, il y a le CRTC.
Yes, of course, there's the CRTC. In Quebec, there's the Régie du Cinéma, the film commission which assesses movies that are marketed. In the United States, there are the Motion Picture Association Association of America, which also rates films. So at present, we have all the means to adopt an effective approach. We have regulations in Quebec and Canada. All we need to do is to ensure that the rating system be included in a piece of legislation to ensure that programs that contain violence be broadcast after 9 p.m., for instance. And this does not prevent people from listening to their favorite television programs, whether it be Rainbow or other programs, after 10 p.m. All we're saying is that films containing violence should be broadcast after 9 p.m.
Mr. Bigra, welcome to our committee. I'm taking a look at a number of things that you have said referring to the code currently in place as being voluntary, and yet every television broadcaster in Canada is subject to that code as a condition of their license. Why then, although it is called voluntary, you keep on referring to it as voluntary? Would you agree with me that it's not really voluntary?
Ben, c'est volontaire dans la mesure.
Well, it's voluntary in the sense that the industry self-regulates, and peers assess the procedures in place. The CRTC says that in Canada, we have a complaints system. That means that if a Canadian citizen believes that a program contravenes the code which broadcasters adopted themselves, they can file a complaint, and it is the Commission, peers, that decide if or not the code was infringed upon. So it is a voluntary system in that the CRTC does not implement it. It is peers that assess its implementation. And that code, in passing, does not contain a definition of violence. There is no single definition of violence in that code, so it is up to broadcasters themselves. So it is in that meaning that I say that it's a voluntary code.
Agree that if we take a look back to 1995, there was a particularly offensive, violent program called Power Rangers. And as a matter of fact, as a result of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, to be precise, and it was a program of some contention, and under the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council that you're referring to, the program disappeared as a result of the direction. And since that time, by the way, there has never been the reappearance of any program like that, nor have there been any complaints of that type. How do you see that your Bill 327 would improve on that?
Ben, justement, on peut prendre le cas.
Well, you can take the example of Power Rangers, but you can also take other examples, other cartoons, which are just as violent. But I insist that there has been an evolution, an increase in the broadcasting of violence. In the past few years, there's been an increase in acts of physical violence. And now there are more and more acts of psychological violence. So we have to deal with the new forms of violence which have nothing to do with a traditional form of violence. So what does Bill C-327 try to do? Well, I believe that if the voluntary code which was implemented by broadcasters resolved all problems, well, why would we not take that voluntary code and turn it into legislation? Nothing would prevent us from doing so. If a voluntary approach is good, why not simply turn it into legislation as Bill C-327 proposes?
Because it is a condition of license that they comply with the code. They cannot have a license. They cannot broadcast these things. However, I'd like to ask you very quickly, in the terrible example, and we never minimize the death of children. I take that I take it as seriously as you do. But in the example of the Patriot that happened to be on television, could that not have been on the television by rental? Isn't the issue that the parent was not accompanying the child? Isn't that the real issue? And if that is the real issue, what difference does Bill 327, what difference would it make? The child was not accompanied. It could have appeared on DVD or on VHS. As it happened, it appeared on television, and the parent's decision to walk away was obviously something of a contributor. How does 327 make any difference? I don't understand.
Ben, écoutez, d'abord, je tiens à vous rappeler que...
Well, I would like to recall that even films that can be rented in video clubs are rated. So there is a rating system, 13 years of age and over, and so on, until 18 years of age and over. If the regulation applied, an 11-year-old who shows up at the video store to rent The Patriot, which is rated 13 years and over, containing violence, that 11-year-old should not get past the counter. That's the fact. So basically, the 11-year-old who shows up at the video store who wants to rent The Patriot, which is rated 13 years and over, containing violence, it's the same thing with video games. The child should not have gotten past the counter. Therefore, he would not have been able to obtain the film at the video store, given that it is rated 13 years and over. And the same rule applies in film theaters. If an 8-year-old wants to see a 13-year-old film, in principle, he is stopped at the box office, which is not the case on television, because on television we have public signals that are available to all.
We're gone a little over time. Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Bigra, for what is obviously a champion of this issue. But I think it's safe to say that I doubt there's anyone sitting around the table that wouldn't support the objectives of less violence, particularly as it affects children on television. And so the question is really one of efficacy rather than objectives. So I need to know why you believe that people who I have to assume share your objectives in the current system, you've given us some numbers that you suggested that you would maintain show that the current system is failing. Could you explain why you think that that's the case?
Simplement parce que
Well, simply because we have to try and find a balance. And from the time we have a number of facts, well, we have to put forward flexible regulations that allow us to protect the best interest of children. That is fundamental. And frankly speaking, I believe that a Canadian citizen who wants to watch a violent film, and I have nothing against that, I believe it should be possible that that citizen be able to watch the film unhindered and can rent the film or even purchase it. But at the same time, that film should not be shown within the prime time hours that are open to children. So this is 2008. And we know that parents are more and more busy. Parents are spending less time at home. Children are more and more left to themselves. We have a duty. Given that the television signals are public, they're not private, given that there is a duty to ensure, to guarantee that we have quality programming, and also to ensure to protect our children. So we must make sure that we regulate our television broadcasting.
I don't think that there's been an answer to the why. I know that you believe the present system is failing, but you really haven't, and you've also said what you'd like to see happen, but I haven't understood your explanation as to why you think that the system is failing, but I'll leave it. It's a complaint-based system, as I understand it. What has happened in the incidence of complaints recently?
dans bon nombre de plaintes, et je pense.
Well, in the case of many complaints, broadcasters will appear in the coming days, and they will be able to explain to you the complaints-based system that is currently used. But in many cases, when the ethics code, the voluntary code is violated, well, public apologies are made. The broadcasters apologize that such and such a film was broadcast at unacceptable hours. So that is a complaint system whereby the broadcaster must apologize. Is that sufficient? I don't believe so. I think an apology once can be acceptable, but we're in a system where broadcasting a violent film is profitable. It's more profitable to broadcast a violent film than to broadcast an educational program at 7 p.m. So there's obviously some economic interest which has an impact on on establishing the primetime broadcasting.
I'm still curious about incidents of complaints. What has happened in terms of the numbers of complaints in recent years?
Well, I don't have the figures before me, but those are questions you can ask the Commission and people from the Commission when they will appear. There are a number of complaints depending on the year. Sometimes there are more complaints than others. I cannot answer that at present.
Suggest to you that the system is improving?
Well, it depends on what kind of complaint you're considering. The number of complaints is not necessarily an indication that the system is functioning properly. What we'd have to do is to examine the type of complaints that are filed, because it's not the importance is not the number, but the type of complaints. So, as I said, there is a system which, in principle, should have helped improve the quality of programs that are broadcast. But the fact is that there have been a significant number of violent films that were broadcast in prime time hours, and that phenomenon is on the increase, as was indicated by the study at the University of Laval.
Switch to Mr. Mallow, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bigra, for being with us this afternoon and to present to us Bill C-327, which was referred to us following a second reading in the House of Commons. Mr. Bigra, do you try to define violence in this bill? Have you considered a definition of violence on television? That's an excellent question. There's a whole debate being held on what television violence is, and it's hard to come to a consensus on that. As I said, there are a number of definitions. One of them, from a media specialist, George Gartner, who, through his study, has defined violence as the intent to harm or to kill someone or to threaten someone. There's also a study by the National Cable Association in the U.S., which defines violence as an explicit manifestation of the use of force or the credible threat of the use of such force with an intent to physically harm an individual or a group of individuals. So there are a number of definitions, but there is no consensus on what violence is. So in my view, that would be a good social debate to have, and a debate which should be initiated by this committee before the regulations are drafted, if Bill C-327 is adopted. So there is no definition. And in particular, there is no definition of psychological violence. Because as I indicated, that is a relatively new phenomenon and which has yet to be properly analyzed. So, as I said, there are a number of definitions and no consensus on what physical violence is, and even less so on what psychological violence is. Now, given that, How are programs rated, programs that are shown on TV, if the concept of violence is rather vague? I'm thinking about the Régie, or the Film Commission in Quebec, which is responsible for that and which includes a number of specialists. And that commission looks at every single movie, and with the experience that they have, rate films. What is interesting to note is that what can be considered violent in the U.S. or should only be seen by 17-year-olds and older, here in Canada, can be viewed by 13-year-olds. So we have two different systems, and there's no definition. There are organizations, rating organizations that exist, but we still have to firm up that definition, and that should be the subject of a debate if Bill C-327 is adopted. So there has to be a debate on regulations and a debate on a definition of violence. When you say that the Council adopted a voluntary code, do they use that classification system to determine whether or not members can broadcast a certain program? Well, broadcasters basically must inform television viewers about the film that they're about to watch. As I indicated in my remarks, there is no obligation, but generally speaking, when you watch a film, the film was rated, and there is a symbol at the start of the film which indicates its rating. And that symbol is shown on a number of occasions during the viewing. But there's no obligation on the part of broadcasters not to broadcast a film which is rated 13 years over with violence. So there's no regulation, indeed.
Thank you. Now we switch to Mr. Fast, please.
Mr. Bigra, I would refer you to Clause 3 of the bill. And it's my understanding that's really the operative section of the bill. Because what it does, it gives the Commission the power to make regulations respecting the broadcasting of violent scenes. And I'm trying to understand exactly what that means and what you see those regulations addressing. Obviously, you've stated a concern that certain violent programs should not be broadcast before 9 p.m. in the evenings. Is that correct?
Oui, tout à fait.
Oui.
Exactly, yes. That is my personal opinion, which is not contained in the bill. All the bill states is that there needs to be regulations made.
That's already contained in the voluntary code, which, as my colleague Mr. Abbott said, is really not voluntary because it's part of the condition of license. But is it also your concern the type of programs that are being shown on TV? Are you concerned about the gravity, the amount or degree of violence that is shown in some of the programs that we see on television even after 9 o'clock?
Non, pas du tout.
No, not at all. What I'm worried about is not the degree of violence in films. I want to make that clear. What I'm concerned is that those movies with acts of violence are broadcast at times when children are watching television. But that there be violent movies, that's one thing. But that they be broadcast, as I said, at 7 p.m., well, in my view, that's a problem. And there's a role for the government to play. not by prohibiting the broadcasting of that film, not at all, but by ensuring that we must be aware that children at certain hours are watching television, whether it be before 9 p.m. or before 10 p.m., and that such films in public interest should be broadcast after that hour.
You've admitted that defining violence is very, very difficult. Now, you gave a definition of violence, but you've acknowledged that the voluntary code doesn't define violence. Are you suggesting that the Commission, through its regulations, define what violence is?
Ben, effectivement, et je pense.
Indeed. I think that the fact that there's no definition of violence within that voluntary code adopted by broadcasters, which I repeat, is a code they implemented themselves and which does not contain obligations with regard to television violence. So yes, there should be a definition of violence within that voluntary code. How come there is no definition within that code? I don't have the answer to that question, but we must realize that that code is not quite enforceable.
It's the Commission, through its regulations, that should define the word violence?
Je pense que c'est le CRTC.
I think it is up to the CRTC to indeed define what violence is on television.
What you're talking about is censorship. Someone has to make the decision as to what is violent and what is not. And actually, in your earlier remarks, you actually referred to trying to find a balance between, and I believe I'm correctly quoting you, a balance between freedom of expression and protection of children. I think all of us acknowledge that's important. We need to find that balance. But finding that balance requires us to draw a line somewhere. I believe what you're saying is it is the CRTC, the Commission, that should be drawing that line, which by its very nature is an act of censorship, because you're going to allow some programming, some won't be, because of the definition of violence you're adopting. Would you agree with me?
Ce que je comprends, moi, du mot censure.
For me, censorship is a prohibition. And that is not my intent at all. I'm not talking about censoring film content or its broadcasting. What I want is to look at the broadcasting time slots and ensure that such violent films be broadcast after 9 p.m. I'm not talking about censorship. For me, censorship is equal to prohibition, and I would be against the total prohibition of the broadcasting of certain films. I think all films are worth broadcasting unless, of course, they contain content that is either pornographic in nature. However, if a film is considered violent by the Film Commission or others, in my view, such films should not be broadcast before 9 p.m. But it's not a prohibition to say that they should be slotted in the after 9 p.m. Time slot. It is not because a film is violent that it should be prohibited. That would be censorship.
Is there any type of violence at all that you feel should be prohibited on television? Any kind of violence? Say it's the most extreme kind of violence. Do you believe that it should be prohibited on television? Extreme, gratuitous violence.
Non, je voudrais pas tomber dans ce débat.
I wouldn't want to fall into a debate where we today define what violence is. That is not the objective of the bill. My bill is intended to make regulations with regard to violence on television, regulations which need to be drawn up, and which I do hope parliamentarians will have a role to play with the help of expert advice. But this bill in no way intends to prohibit the broadcasting of violent films.
Okay, thank you. And
That's it for our questioning in this particular session. We can't get a complete round in, so thank you very much for appearing today, and we will recess for approximately 7 minutes. Thank you. We'll call the meeting back to order again, and I welcome our next guests, our next witnesses from the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, Mr. Van Finkenstein, Mr. Valet, and or Ms. Valet, excuse me, and Mr. Hutton. Thank you very much for appearing today and on such short notice. So if you'd like to start your presentation, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Je remercie le comité de nous avoir invités à venir faire.
I would like to thank the committee for inviting us to express our views on Bill C-327, which proposes to amend the Broadcasting Act. As we understand it, the principal aim of the bill is to contribute to solving the problem of violence in society by reducing violence in the programming offered to the public, including children.
The act by solving means violence should not be glorified or depicted too graphically. And by reducing, we assume the bill means restricting the most graphic and inappropriate portrayal of violence to time periods when children are unlikely to be watching television. Given these interpretation of the key terms, we regard the aims of the bill as entirely laudable. These aims are ours as well.
However, it is important to remember that the CRTC does not mandate or dictate programming, but rather ensures that it conforms to the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. In particular, the Act states that programming should be of high standard, respectful of equality rights, and reflective of Canadian values. In pursuing these objectives, the Act also directs the CRTC to respect freedom of expression as guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The system we have now in place to deal with these issues is a collaborative one that relies largely on self-regulation by the industry in accordance with an obligatory code on violence. This code was developed by the Canadian Association of Broadcasters and approved by the CRTC. In addition, the CRTC holds the authority to serve as a final arbiter when required on these issues. Today I will focus on the enforcement of programming standards on violence. I would like to take you briefly through the process to show you how the system works when a complaint is made. First, the CRTC requires all broadcasts to adhere to a code on violence as a condition of license. However, it suspends this obligation as long as a broadcaster is a member in good standing of the CBSC, the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, and is therefore bound by the CAB code. The complainant may bring the issue to the broadcaster or the CRTC. If one of the private broadcasters is involved and that broadcaster is a member in good standing of the CBSC, the complaint may be brought directly to the CBSC, or it is forwarded by the Commission to the CBSC if it comes to us. The CBSC is an independent organization established by the Canadian Association of Broadcasters with the approval of the CRTC. Once such a complaint is made, the Council will determine whether an infraction of the CBSC's violence code has occurred. This is a code which the CRTC regards as an important standard, and its terms provide a framework that is used across all sectors of the industry. Among other things, it prohibits gratuitous violence. It requires that viewer advisories accompany programs with violent content. These are verbal warnings that indicate the nature of the content. It requires broadcasters to display a rating that informs parents of the suitable age groups for the programs. It establishes a watershed hour. Depictions of violence intended for adult audiences must be broadcast after 9 p.m. And it sets out detailed restrictions on the portrayal of violence in children and programs. A private broadcaster who is found to have violated code must acknowledge the violation with an announcement on the air and must provide the Council with evidence that this has been done. If the violations of the same kind have occurred more than 3 times, the broadcaster is required to show within 30 days why they should remain a member in good standing of the CBSC. Now, when the complainant concerns a public broadcaster such as CBC, an educational broadcasters, or a broadcaster who is not a member in good standing of the CBSC, it is the CRTC who will hear the complaint. The CBC will also hear any complaining cases where the complainant is not satisfied with the resolution provided by the CBSC. If the CRTC finds that a violation has occurred, it will issue a public decision to that effect, and this goes on the record of the licensee. Such a decision may be considered when broadcaster's license comes up for renewal. Measures, even severe ones, can be imposed at that time. That's the principal difference. That CBSC, it gets corrected. With us, not only does it get corrected, but it goes on the record and will be considered at time of renewal. Now, I've taken you through the enforcement process as it is today so that you may understand our reaction to the bill before you. We have no problems with sections 1 and 2 of the bill, given the interpretation I mentioned at the outset. We do, however, have reservations about section 3, which would add 2 new sections identified at 10.1 and 10.2 to the Broadcasting Act. These additions would require the Commission to make regulation on violent scenes of televisions, including those in programming intended for children. It would also require the monitoring of compliance and the punishment for non-compliance in accordance to law. This is contrary to our regulatory approach. For us, it has become a high priority to use regulation as an instrument of policy only when regulation is necessary. That means we will regulate only when no other effective means is available to achieve the desired purpose. And when we do regulate, it will be with smarter and lighter regulation. Le système actuel repose sur l'autoréglementation de l'industrie.
We believe that the present system, based on industry self-regulation in adherence to obligatory codes and backed up by the CRTC as the final arbiter, does provide an effective means to achieve the desired purpose. We therefore cannot support the provisions of Bill C-327 that call for prescriptive regulation in lieu of industry self-regulation backstopped by conditions of license. We do, however, share the aims of this bill when it comes to effective enforcement of our policies governing content standards. For some time, we have felt the lack of a full range of penalties to deal with violations.
It would be more stronger and sharper if we were given the power to impose administrative monetary penalties or AMPs. In other words, the Commission should be able to fine a broadcaster for infractions. These fines would be proportionate to the offence. They would be large enough to hurt and serve as a deterrent. The CRTC has such powers as means of enforcement under the Telecommunication Act, and it strikes us it is equally needed in broadcasting. At the moment, the only penalties we can impose are either on the relatively light or excessively heavy. At the light end, we have an on-air announcement required by the CHPC or public decision rendered by the CRTC in response to a complaint. At the heavy end, we can shorten the offender's terms of license at renewal time or deny renewal remedy. These are very blunt instruments. We need something in between. Those are the AMPs I mentioned. If the committee so desires, we could have our legal staff draft the appropriate amendments to Bill C-327, which would replace the proposed section 10.1 and 10.2 and replace them with a system of monetary penalties. We note that the bill calls for the Commission to review the new regulation after 5 years. Should the bill be enacted with the amendments we suggested, we would have no suggestion to undertaking such a review. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to express our view, and we are ready to answer your questions.
Okay. Ms. Fry, I think you have the floor for the first question, please.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I wanted to ask some clear questions. What other indicators do you have that programming or violence is being reported, or it's a concern of the public, or that the self-regulation of the industry is in fact compliant with the spirit and letter of all of the acceptable limits on violence that is already there in legislation. Is it just reporting? Is that the only indicator that you have? Can you suggest other indicators?
Well, we operate basically on a complaints basis. If people complain about the programming, if they feel the programming is too graphic, is too drastic, or is shown in hours when it shouldn't be shown, they'll complain. And most of these complaints are dealt with by the CBSCs, and they're dealt with. If you would like to know the exact numbers of complaints, we can give them to you. My colleague, Mr. Hutton, has them. Scott?
No, I wondered if you had other indicators by which we could measure the compliance of the self-regulation of the industry itself. Only complaints, that's your only indicator that people are happy.
Well, complaints and the remedy of the complaints as enacted either by the CBSC or us.
Sure. Do you have any indicators that you would suggest other than complaints?
No, I mean, we don't. And as I say, it's a complaint-driven system. We set up standards. We go on the assumption that broadcasters are in the business to make money, to produce broadcasting appeals to Canadians. So they get a license from us. The license says apply to the standards. We assume they apply to the standards. Obviously, there may be cases where they either fail to or where there's a difference of interpretation what the standards are. Those will then generate a complaint, and we deal with that complaint.
Do you believe that a complaint-based system is an appropriate way to monitor this?
Yes, I mean, that's our general approach in all of this. We are dealing with the creative industry. You don't want to be too prescriptive. So you basically say, set your standards, administer them, and we will make sure that you adhere to them.
I know that's the current approach, Mr. von Finkelstein. What I'm asking you is, do you think it is the appropriate approach? Do you think it is sufficient? Do you think there are other ways in which we can approach the issue of compliance by broadcasters other than complaints, which is hoping that the public will have the time to write, et cetera, et cetera? Because if this is self-regulatory, do you think it is an appropriate way? Should we change it? And if so, how do you think we should?
The short answer is no. I think that this is the appropriate approach. Obviously, there are other approaches. You could have an inspection system. You could have a monitoring system. You could have a reporting system, all of it. They're very costly, they are very intrusive, and I'm not convinced they would be more effective. I think the system that we have strikes the right balance between protecting the public by ensuring that there is a code that's adhered to, by also having a system that punishes those who offend the code.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Ms. Morani?
Oui.
Okay, thanks.
Merci,
I didn't have a name.
messieurs, dames.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I must admit, Mr. von Finkenstein, can I call you Conrad? Thank you. I have to admit, I don't quite understand how you can be monitoring broadcasters based on rules that they've adopted themselves. It's like to say that the police will go to see the criminals and ask them what standards they want, and then they'll watch over the criminals like that. It's a bit strange, no? No. Standards are drafted by the industry. You're right in that. But we must agree to it, which we did. We've held hearings, we've looked at the code, and we believe it reflects appropriate standards for broadcasters. They drafted the codes, but the standards were approved by us. Does that mean that like a 13-year and over rating, like the standards with regard to violence, to nudity, etc., to give a film a 13-year-old rating, that those standards are already defined based on what broadcasters themselves decided? we asked broadcasters to draft a code which reflects social standards. What is the level of acceptable violence? What is the level of acceptable nudity? What can we show during the daytime? What can we show during evenings? So they, following consultations among industry stakeholders and the public at large, drafted a draft report which we held hearings on. We examined that draft code, we made some changes, and we finally approved a version which we believed reflected generally agreed standards. And that is now the code to which all broadcasters are bound. But do you not think that it is up to elected representatives to establish those codes with regard to violence? Because the level of acceptance to violence or nudity has changed with time. What I find strange is how it is broadcasters themselves who drafted the code. But I understand your position. I would like to move on to another issue, something Ms. Fry raised, the complaints-based system. Do you not think that using a complaints-based system places you in a wait-and-see attitude? I would have hoped that you were more progressive and that you could check which broadcasters respect and which don't respect the code before having to receive a complaint. When the code was drafted, broadcasters hired experts in the field. They commissioned studies to come up with their final code. And as I said earlier, we approved that code. It reflects something which we approve. This is a self-regulatory approach. It's a question of balance between costs, efficiency, expertise, and results. Should the government do everything, regulate, prohibit, prosecute? Or do we want a system where broadcasters will self-regulate? I believe it is in their advantage, because if a broadcaster showed too much violence, they would lose viewers. We're talking about a creative industry here. And we don't want to stifle creativity. So it's a question of balance. And in our view, the approach that we've adopted here, the self-regulatory approach under the supervision of the CRTC, has given us this right balance. Do I have any time left, Mr. Chair? You said earlier that it would cost a lot. Are you talking about the current system? No, I'm talking about a system like you would like to implement. So a more prescriptive system. A system which would be more proactive and would not be based on complaints and which would require regulation from the CRTC. That would cost more. How much do you assess those costs at? It depends on the type of regulation, but the more prescriptive you are, the more expensive it is. But it's not only a question of cost. There's also the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we have to respect. And if we're too prescriptive with regard to content, there will be problems with regard to the Charter.
So
D'accord, thank you.
I have to
Prochain tour.
interject. Mr. Sixay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being with us, Mr. von Finkenstein. We appreciate you taking the time, and your colleagues. I wonder if you could tell us when the existing standards were established, and if there's been any review of them since that time.
My colleague Scott Hutton will answer that.
I think they were initially established in 1993, and there was a review in 1997. There has not been a formal review of them since that time.
And were there any changes made in 97 at the time of that review?
There were some adjustments, yes.
Okay. I would be interested in knowing the number of complaints related to violence that have been dealt with, and can you give us some of those statistics?
Yes, according to our statistics, and these are complaints that come to both the CRTC and those that are referred to the CBSC. Mm-hmm. And we have, for our last full year that we have a formal report published, we have at about 125 complaints on the issue of violence, and our statistics for this year are tracking about the same.
And can you tell us how those were resolved? What was the final outcome of those complaints, and was any action taken against broadcasters in light of those complaints?
There approximately 50% of them are resolved upon first discussion. The first step is always to ask the broadcaster to respond, and respond both to the body that's reviewing the entity and to the complainant, and approximately 50% of them are resolved at that level. Then it goes on beyond to a question of interpretation, and you end up with a situation where you have a small minority of all of those that come to the CRTC. There's about 3 to 5 a year that end up where we end up finding an issue with the occurrence.
So of those 3 to 5, are those the ones where the broadcaster would be disciplined in some way?
Yes.
And can you tell us what kinds of discipline have happened recently, and maybe in the most recent years?
Most of the discipline that has occurred before the CRTC has basically been the issuance of a public decision outlining the failing, and a discussion at the renewal period.
And has there ever been a restriction placed on a license renewal, or a shortening of a license, or even the outright refusal of a license regarding related to a complaint related to violence?
We have not had such cases in television, and not with respect to violence.
In the opening statement, it was mentioned that there was a process directly to the CRTC for broadcasters who weren't part of the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. Are there any broadcasters that aren't members of that, other than the CBC and educational broadcasters?
Yes, the majority of private broadcasters are members of the CBSC, but there are a minority that are not, and the complaints for those broadcasters come directly to the CRTC, and we follow through in applying the CAB's code with those broadcasters.
Can you characterize that group in some way? Are they independent broadcasters? Is it a particular network? Is it how would you characterize that?
I would say
group?
the major broadcasters are all members, with the exception of the public broadcasters, and it would be more smaller entities.
Okay. When I was poking around doing some research, I found a letter from Mr. Spicer, I guess a predecessor of Mr. von Finkenstein's, and he talked about the children's agenda of the CRTC and a formula 80, 10, and 10, which was 80% public education programs, 10% technological solutions like the VCHIP, and 10% of the voluntary code. I wonder, is that still a sort of a direction of the CRTC? Do you still put efforts into public education around the issue of violence, particularly with regards to children? Or can you talk a bit about if that initiative is still in place?
Must tell you, catch me totally by surprise. This is the 3 predecessors before me, so yes. I was not aware of this policy. Our policy right now is very, very clearly, as I enunciated, is basically that we feel that the code, the way it is the administration through the CBSC, which has been exemplary, addresses the issue.
So, I mean, that would seem a fairly significant change if that is the case, because Mr. Spicer said that only 10% of the CRT's efforts was going into voluntary codes and 90% was in other directions. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe say why that kind of significant change might have happened.
I think the broadcasters continue. I think there's a few efforts that have been put in place. I think maybe the 80-10-10 is maybe a little bit beyond what our memory, but what is occurring right now is certainly through the voluntary system. It's one of the magics of one of the great things of the voluntary system. Broadcasters, which is their business to getting messages out, do publicize the various efforts that are put in place, may it be the existence of the CBSC, the existence of a complaint mechanism, the broadcast also when they do fail. That is one of the recourses that the CBSC relates to. So the message does get out through the broadcasting side. Same thing is there are advisories before every and during commercial breaks for programming. You do have the ratings that are announced and published for every program. So there is a continuing effort, and it's through the broadcasters. It's not an ongoing effort by the CRTC.
Okay.
Also, you're talking about a totally different time period. I mean, this was long before we had internet and all sorts of new media and other. Mr. Spicer?
Okay.
According to the site I saw, yeah.
Okay, that's we'll switch over. I think Mr. Abbott has one short question, and then we'll switch to Mr. Batter, so time will be shared.
Good, thank you. Thank you for coming. I think this discussion we've had with you has indicated that this bill is far broader than just simply restricting hours, as the proposer of the bill seemed to be testifying today. Mr. von Finkenstein, you spoke about being able to come up with some kind of enforcement. You were talking about something in between. When I was looking at Section 32 of the Broadcasting Act, I thought that the CRTC has the ability to impose fines, but you're telling us that Section 32 isn't a tool that's commonly used. Could you just, you gave us a brief explanation, but I wonder if you could just expand on it. And the second question would be, if this bill was not successful and was not amended as you suggested, would you see there being a reason for there to be an amendment to the CRTC Act so that you would have the enforcement that you're after?
First of all, Section 32 is the standard provision of criminal offenses that you find in most acts, saying if you breach this act, you're guilty of a criminal offense, which means you have to go to court, you have to prove the offense, you have to prove it to a criminal standard of proof, i.e. beyond all reasonable doubt, and it's also a fairly lengthy process, and it brings the full majesty of the law against somebody who has committed a criminal act. That's what we're not talking about here. This is not. We're talking about here, in effect, it's called administrative monetary penalty. In common parlance, it's called a fine. It's in effect, and you have to prove it on a civil standard, i.e. in the balance of probability rather than beyond all reasonable doubt. It's also going to be very quickly done while the offense is there, while the program is still on the air. The criminal process that you have, it's first of all disproportionate. Secondly, you would be, by the time you bring up the program, may no longer be on the air, and it may be totally irrelevant. And it would be also very difficult to prove that somebody deliberately, with full intent, went out to breach the code and did something that was an explicit violation of the code. While what we are saying is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have now basically the power of shaming. If shame, as CBSC does it, they say you've done wrong, admit it, and we do the same thing and we put it on the record. Or else we can sort of have a nuclear bomb, to withdraw the license. There's absolutely nothing in between. And what we suggest for these things, which may be infractions of various gradations, there should be an appropriate penalty. That means, as far as your second question is concerned, if this bill is not amended, yes, this AMPS power is needed not only with regard to violence question, but with regard to other issues that we regulate too, and hopefully we will see it someday. It just, since it was raised in this bill specifically, and there's a concern with violence, I thought it was appropriate to raise it with you.
Okay. Mr. Bader.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all of you for appearing before our committee, and also to commend Monsieur Bigra for his noble intentions in putting his bill forward again. Mr. von Finkenstein, in your mind and the opinion of the CRTC, is this bill C-327 simply redundant, given the rules system already in place by the CRTC and the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council?
that's really for you to decide, I think, partially. But I mean, the bill in its whereas clause at the beginning says, whereas the number of violent scenes broadcast on television during the hours when children watch television, namely before 9 p.m., has nevertheless increased. And I think that's what it's trying to address and trying to emphasize the need to protect our children, make sure that those offensive programs appear after 9 p.m. And as I said, I agree with that. And we have a workable system. This would strengthen it, perfect it if you want, etc. Whether you want to enact it or not, because like any regulatory power, of course, brings with it some negative side effects that may lead to more litigation or stifle creativity. That's a question that's really up to you.
Mr. Hutton or Ms. Valet, do you have anything to add regarding that? Do you think that this bill is redundant? Because I mean, we're anxious to hear your opinion on this. That's why you're before committee today. We understand that this ultimately rests with parliamentarians, but that's why you're called today.
I think what we're suggesting is that improvements can be made to recognize the existing system, because we believe in the existing system, and we can build upon the existing system through this route.
Okay, thank you for that. Our time's up for that. Now I go to Mr. Belanger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to you all.
Or actually, the question probably goes to Mr. Hutton, but it's back on the complaints. You said there were about 125. Are those 125 directed to complaints about violence in children, or are they, the entire package of complaints?
It would be towards the entire package of violence. We receive about 10,000 complaints on broadcasting matters a year, and we have 125, according to our own tracking system, on violence, not specifically to children.
Children?
No, violence on television.
You have 10,000 complaints a year?
Yeah.
And 125 are... Has there ever been an analysis of these complaints? Would you share that? What nature are they? I'm surprised that there's that many. I'd be curious to see how many originate from people watching broadcasters that are members of the CBSC and of members that are and the broadcasters that are not members of the CBSC. Do you have that distinction?
Can we break this down to several questions? You said that there's an analysis of what? Of the 10,000 complaints or the complaints regarding to violence?
Well, of both.
Okay. Secondly, I mean, most of you really appreciate a huge number of complaints are heard by the CBSC. They will be appearing before you, and so they can tell you what about the complaints that they have and what kind of analysis they have done. The complaints to us, a lot of those 10,000 are of general nature, complaining about of ads or particular programming or the poor variety of programming whatsoever. If you want to make a breakdown, Mr. Hutton can walk you through it. Go ahead, sir.
Perhaps provide that to the committee.
Okay,
we can provide you with our annual report, which includes that data.
Fair enough. I sit reprimanded. Can you direct me on the 125? How many would be directed to violence in children, and how many are not?
We don't have that with us, but we can provide that to the committee.
Would you know of the 125, how many stem from broadcasters that are members of, and how many from broadcasters that are not members of the CBSC?
We can provide you with that at the same time.
Now, the answer, my other question, I gather, has been pretty well answered, because Mr. Van Finkelstein, I was going through your remarks, and at one point you say you believe this present system does provide an effective means to achieve the desired purpose. Yet, a little further, you say, however, you think that the penalty side has to be improved. So it's not that effective.
No, it's probably, if and when we have a hard case, we really have no means of dealing with it. Fortunately, so far, the system has worked very well. broadcasters are very responsible and very responsive, and when these kinks have come up, they have dealt with that and they have put them there. We've had, however, as you're probably aware of in radio and so, cases where that wasn't the case and where we found that the lack of intermediate penalties, I may call it, is really quite hampering. Yeah. And that's why I mention it here that, if undoubtedly violence is a big issue and may become a bigger issue, it would be, to round out the system, having AMPs would be a very desirable thing to do.
Mr. Chair, final question. Has the CRTC, to your knowledge, in the past asked for such provisions to be enacted?
Yes, there have been, as I say, we have some in telecom side already with regard to the do not call list. And there was also a bill last year which was enacted which provided them in respect of other issues under telecom. On the broadcasting side, has it been done before? I honestly don't know the answer. Scott?
I must say I don't know that answer either. We have not asked for them recently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Mallow.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to you, Mr. von Finkenstein, for appearing before us this afternoon to discuss Bill C-327 and consequences. In your opening remarks, you've indicated that the voluntary code put forward by broadcasters was supervised by the CRTC and you approved the code. You also said that before 9 p.m. there should be no scenes of violence for adult programming. With regard to that aspect of the code, how do you determine whether a program contains violence intended for an adult audience? Did you regulate that definition per se? I will ask Mr. Hutton to respond. We apply the code when we are asked to intervene with regard to a complaint. In the code, there are indications with regard to children programming. There are a number of factors. I believe there are 8 factors which are applied. Basically speaking, our staff views the movie, makes sure that the various indications contained in the code have been respected. Was there violence? Was that violence broadcast before 9 p.m.? There might be exceptions. And then, after going through those indications, we will come to a conclusion as to whether there was excessive violence, in which case we notify the broadcaster. In your opening remarks, you also indicate that you would have liked to have a greater array of penalties. You even spoke about fines. And fines that would be sufficiently, would be large enough to act as a deterrent for broadcasters who show violence and which goes against the code. What, in your view, would be the fine which could deter broadcasters from showing such violence before 9 p.m.? It's not a specific fine, it's an array of fines. In the telecommunications sector, for instance, the fines So, for instance, in the Telecommunications Act, fines run from $1,500 to $15,000, depending on the seriousness of the offense. And so we have to discuss what an appropriate range would be. We do not want to bankrupt the broadcaster, and so we simply want to have a strong enough deterrent and ensure that broadcasters do not ignore the code. So you refer to a range of fines. Is that something you would apply in that particular case? No, I think the fines would range higher than that. But if you will, we can give you a draft of amendments with regard to the fines. And I don't want to take a number out of a hat. I think we need to consider fines used in other industries which are similar to this one in order to specify the appropriate ones. At the CRTC, have you seen an increase in the acts of violence on television before 9 p.m.? Do you have tracking measures to assess that? No, I don't have that type of data.
On because very shortly the bells are going to ring, so and we have a little other business to do. So we move over to Mr. Chong, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for any of the three witnesses here, and it concerns the standards, the basis on which the violence code, the Canadian Broadcast Standards Violence Code, is based on, or the CRTC's own code when it comes to public or educational broadcasters. Over the last number of decades, the jurisprudence in Canada with respect to materials containing sexual or violent elements has evolved from one of the community standards test involving standards of public decency or public morality to one involving the harm principle or the harm test, where materials that can be censored must be shown to be harmful to society or harmful to others in society. And so in light of that, my question is, with respect to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council or with respect to the CRTC, what basis or studies or empirical evidence is out there to support the CBSC's violence code, or in terms of the CRTC itself, its own adjudication when it comes to the harm test, when it comes to adjudicating public or educational broadcasters. So what evidence is out there to support the present codes, whether they be at the CRTC or at the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council?
I would go at the question differently. The bill before suggests to be a review of the code and the standards, etc. As we told you, it was adopted in when Martin? In 1996. So, and obviously, as you mentioned, community standards have changed the way we look at these things, and it may very well be appropriate to review it. I mean, whatever studies we have and whatever we had for the code as adopted at that point in time, date from that time, and so I don't think they would answer the question that you are addressing. And yes, these things are not cast in stone. They reflect the standards of the community, and they have to be looked at periodically and recalibrated as the case may be. And that's why I specifically said in my opening remark, the review that the bill suggests, if the bill is adopted, I think would be very appropriate.
Mr. Batters, did you have a short one?
Just, well, it's not, I realize we have bells.
Okay, it's not short.
And as I said
Mr.
that,
Abbott,
the bells have
I
started ringing.
think Mr. Abbott has would like a point of order.
Yeah, I have a quick matter to deal with. I've asked the chair under a point of order. I had committed to the committee that I was going to be getting back with a response from the department with respect to the guidelines on Bill C-10. This is the response that I got. The guidelines do not exist, cannot exist before Bill C-10 is passed. There's simply no guidelines to provide the committee. When Bill C-10 is passed, we'll be holding consultation on the guidelines. With respect to the department official who was quoted on Thursday, he simply misspoke when he implied that there were guidelines in existence that the department was working on. There are no guidelines. He misspoke. And after C-10 is passed, once the legislation is passed, the Minister will direct the Department to begin consultations with industry officials and stakeholders. After the consultations, guidelines will be discussed.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up.
Also, I believe, and I'd have to verify it, but I believe we'd also asked about regulations.
I'm sorry. I don't recall that. This was, maybe we can talk off.
It's just that, Mr. Chairman, if I may, and it won't be long.
Yep.
Now, I understand we have to go and vote. The matter that's before us, there's a lot of people asking questions, and I think that if indeed people should be directed to current regulation adopted in 2005, where it's quite revealing what's in it and what's not in it, and then there are some guidelines currently. So if the those perhaps should also be in public domain so people can see them. And we've got a desire here for public information, for information to be made public, and would hope that those at least could be obtained by our research staff at the very least and distributed to the members, because I believe they exist.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just before we're going to take a 30-second pause here. We have a little wee bit of business. It'll only take a minute. Yes, Mr. Sexay.
Chair, I'm very concerned about remaining while the bells are ringing, given that once this session we've already had the whips of the government and official opposition proceed down the aisle before the bells finished ringing. And so I'm not anxious to stay now that the bells are ringing. I want to be in the House, especially for the kind of the important vote that we're having this evening.
You'll be there, but we have to. If we want this committee to carry on, we have a budget that we have to pass so we're just going out of the television, and we're gonna proceed. I'm quite sure that I want to be in my seat too, and I will be there. We just do this here quick.